I discovered the testimonies in a vault beneath the ruins of Biel-Tan, sealed away by farseers who had foreseen their own world's destruction, yet still hoped that someone, someday, might learn from their civilization's greatest tragedy. The crystal matrices that contained these memories were unlike anything in Imperial archives. Living jewels that sang with the voices of the dead, their surfaces shifting between colors that had no names in human languages. The first voice belonged to an Aeldari poet named Iriel Morvain, who had lived through the final centuries of their empire's glory. Her words, preserved in crystalline song, spoke of beauty so perfect it could drive mortals mad, of cities that spanned continents and floated among the stars, of a people who had achieved everything that lesser species could only dream of, and who had been destroyed by that very achievement. We were the galaxy's first children, her voice whispered across millennia of grief. Before humanity learned to make fire, before the orcs knew war, before even the Necrons surrendered to their deathless sleep, we walked among the stars as gods. We shaped worlds with a thought, created life with a song, and bent the very fabric of reality to our will. Time meant nothing to us, for we were immortal. Distance meant nothing, for we had conquered space itself. We believed ourselves beyond consequence, beyond judgment, beyond the very concepts of loss and mortality. As I listened to these ancient voices by candlelight in my study, high above the hive spires of Mordian, I began to understand the true scope of what had been lost when the Aeldari fell. This was not simply the collapse of another empire, but the death of possibility itself. The end of the galaxy's first and greatest civilization, and the warning of what awaited any species that reached too high without understanding the price of transcendence. What follows is their story, told in the voices of those who witnessed the rise and fall of the most beautiful and terrible empire the galaxy has ever known. Chapter 1. The First Awakening. The earliest testimony comes from an Aeldari, whose name translates roughly as First Light of Understanding, a being so ancient that their memories stretch back to their species' initial emergence into galactic consciousness. Their account was preserved in a soul stone of such purity that touching it left my fingers stained with light 4 days afterward. I remember the first moment we understood what we were. The voice sang with harmonics that seemed to resonate in my bones. It was not a gradual awakening, but a sudden flowering of consciousness that spread across our entire species in the span of a single generation. One day, we were clever beasts, no different from the countless other primitive species that crawled across the galaxy's worlds. The next, we were gods in all but name. The transformation that elevated the Aeldari from mere intelligence to cosmic awareness had occurred during the final phases of the war in heaven, when the Old Ones, desperate for allies against the implacable Necrons, had reached into the genetic structure of promising species and awakened potentials that would normally have taken millions of years to develop. The Old Ones spoke to us in dreams and visions, First Light remembered. They showed us glimpses of what we might become if we embraced the gifts they offered. Not just psychic power, though that was part of it, but something far more precious. The ability to perceive and interact with the deeper currents of reality itself. They taught us to see the warp not as an alien realm, but as an extension of our own consciousness. The early centuries following their awakening were described as a golden age of discovery and expansion. The young Aeldari race spread across the galaxy with the enthusiasm of children exploring a vast playground, their newfound abilities allowing them to traverse interstellar distances through the Webway network that the Old Ones had constructed. Every world we encountered was a new canvas for our creativity, First Light recalled. We reshaped continents for aesthetic purposes, guided the evolution of lesser species toward greater beauty, and filled empty space with constructs of crystallized thought and living song. The universe itself seemed to welcome our touch, responding to our desires with eager compliance. Yet, even in those early days of triumph, there were signs of the corruption that would eventually destroy them. The Aeldari's enhanced psychic abilities came with an increased capacity for sensation and emotion that gradually began to overwhelm their rational judgment. We felt everything more intensely than other species, First Light explained. Joy that could shatter mountains, sorrow that could drain entire seas, rage that could burn worlds. At first, we viewed this as simply another aspect of our superiority. What were mere mortals compared to beings who could experience the full spectrum of existence with such intensity? The construction of the Webway network provided the Aeldari with unprecedented freedom of movement throughout the galaxy. Unlike the crude warp travel that other species would later develop, the Webway allowed instantaneous transportation without the risks associated with direct exposure to the immaterium. The Webway was our greatest achievement and our greatest mistake, First Light reflected with obvious pain. It connected every world in our empire with tunnels of crystallized space-time, allowing us to travel from one end of the galaxy to the other in moments. But more than that, it connected our minds, creating a psychic network that amplified every thought, every emotion, every desire across our entire civilization. The isolation from the warp that the Webway provided also had unintended consequences. While it protected the Aeldari from the predators and chaotic influences that plagued other psychic species, it also prevented them from understanding the true nature of the forces they were manipulating. We thought ourselves masters of the immaterium, First Light admitted. We could reach into the warp and pluck thoughts from the void, reshape reality with focused will, even create living beings from pure psychic energy. Yet we never understood that every action in that realm had consequences, that every emotion we felt with such intensity left echoes in the warp that would eventually coalesce into something beyond our control. The technological achievements of this early period defied comprehension, even by the standards of the dark age of technology. The Aeldari created materials that existed partially in multiple dimensions, constructed cities that could exist in several locations simultaneously, and developed weapons that could kill concepts rather than merely physical beings. We built wonders that would make your greatest forge worlds weep with envy, First Light said with a mixture of pride and regret. Wraithbone that grew according to our thoughts, spirit stones that could preserve consciousness beyond death, and gates that could open passages not just through space but through time itself. Every tool we created was an extension of our will, every construct a manifestation of our desire for perfection. The early encounters with other species revealed the growing distance between the Aeldari and the rest of galactic civilization. What had begun as benevolent curiosity gradually transformed into condescending superiority as their power continued to grow. We tried to uplift the lesser races, First Light recalled. We taught them art, science, philosophy, everything we thought might help them approach even a fraction of our own enlightenment. Yet they consistently disappointed us with their limitations, their short lives, their inability to perceive the beauty we created for them. Over time, we began to see them not as potential equals but as pets at best, obstacles at worst. The first recorded contact with humanity occurred during this period, when early human explorers encountered Aeldari vessels in what would later become the Gothic sector. The meeting, documented in both human and Aeldari archives, established patterns that would define their relationship for millennia to come. The humans were quaint, First Light observed, with what might have been fondness. So young, so earnest in their desire to understand the galaxy around them. We found their crude attempts at art amusing, their philosophical questions endearing in their simplicity. Some among us advocated for more intensive contact, believing that this species might eventually develop into something approaching worthiness. Others counseled patience. Surely, such an energetic race would either evolve beyond their limitations or destroy themselves in the attempt. First Light's final memories of this period carry a melancholy that seems to permeate the very crystal that contains them. I lived through our species' childhood and adolescence, they concluded. I watched us transform from wonder-struck explorers into confident masters of creation itself. Yet, even then, in moments of quiet reflection, some of us wondered if we were moving too quickly, reaching too high, demanding too much of ourselves and the universe around us. Those concerns were dismissed as the fears of the overcautious, remnants of our primitive past that we needed to transcend. Perhaps, if we had listened to those doubts, if we had proceeded with more humility rather than less, the tragedy that followed might have been avoided. But we were young in our power, drunk on our own capabilities, and convinced of our own inherent righteousness. The fall, when it came, was as inevitable as it was devastating. Chapter 2. The Height of Empire. The testimony that follows comes from architect Prime Lotharian Sunweaver, whose memories were preserved in the crystal matrix of a Craftworlds infinity circuit. His account reveals the Aeldari civilization at its absolute zenith, a time when their power seemed limitless and their future assured. I was present at the convocation of worlds when we decided to remake the galaxy according to our vision of perfect harmony. Sunweaver's voice carried undertones of crystalline music that seemed to make the air itself sing. Representatives from 10,000 worlds gathered in the crystal city of Asurian, their combined psychic presence creating auroras that could be seen from neighboring star systems. We had reached the point where individual planets could no longer contain our ambitions. It was time to think on a truly cosmic scale. The Aeldari Empire of this period spanned millions of worlds, each one a masterwork of environmental and aesthetic engineering. Entire star systems had been reconfigured to maximize both beauty and functionality, with planets moved into new orbits, suns artificially aged or rejuvenated, and space itself sculpted into galleries of living art. My greatest work was the spiral of blessed contemplation, Sunweaver recalled with obvious pride. 7 worlds arranged in a precise mathematical progression, each one representing a different aspect of Aeldari philosophical thought. The first was dedicated to logic and reason, its continents shaped like vast geometric theorems. The 7th embodied pure emotion, its landscapes shifting in response to the feelings of those who walked upon them. Connecting them all was a bridge of crystallized light that existed partially in the warp, allowing thoughts and sensations to flow freely between the worlds. The population of the Empire had grown to numbers that defied calculation. Freed from the constraints of mortality through a combination of longevity treatments and consciousness transfer technologies, the Aeldari had spread throughout the galaxy in numbers that made even their vast territories seem crowded. Death had become optional, Sunweaver explained. When age or injury claimed our physical forms, our souls could be preserved in spirit stones and housed in new bodies crafted from wraithbone and psychic energy. Some chose to remain in these artificial forms permanently, becoming beings of pure thought capable of existing in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Others preferred to return to flesh after brief sojourns in the realm of pure consciousness. The technological achievements of this period represented the absolute pinnacle of what any species had ever accomplished. The Aeldari had not merely mastered their physical environment, but had begun to reshape the fundamental laws of reality itself. We created pocket universes where different physical constants applied, Sunweaver noted. Realms where time flowed backward, where thought became substance, where the distinction between self and environment dissolved entirely. These became workshops for our greatest artists, who found the normal universe too restrictive for their most ambitious projects. The Webway network had expanded beyond its original purpose as a transportation system, becoming a vast nervous system that connected not just Aeldari worlds, but Aeldari minds. The collective consciousness that resulted allowed for unprecedented coordination of effort and sharing of experience. Individual achievement became meaningless when every success was instantly shared among billions of minds, Sunweaver reflected. A poet on one world could compose a verse that would immediately inspire a sculptor on another to create a statue that would motivate a musician on a third to write a symphony. Our entire civilization became a single, vast work of art, constantly creating and recreating itself. Yet this very interconnectedness began to create problems that the Aeldari were slow to recognize. The psychic network that allowed them to share experiences also meant that negative emotions and destructive impulses could spread through their population with unprecedented speed. We began to notice disturbing trends in our collective consciousness, Sunweaver admitted. Periods of inexplicable melancholy that would affect entire sectors simultaneously. Waves of anger that could incite violence across multiple star systems. Most troubling of all were the pleasure cults that began to emerge, groups dedicated to experiencing ever more intense sensations regardless of the consequences. The abundance and perfection that characterized Aeldari civilization created an unexpected problem: the gradual erosion of meaning and purpose. When every desire could be fulfilled instantly, and every goal achieved without effort, many Aeldari found themselves struggling with existential emptiness. We had achieved everything our ancestors could have dreamed of, Sunweaver observed. Yet achievement without struggle, success without sacrifice, pleasure without pain, these began to feel hollow to many of us. Some sought meaning in ever more complex artistic projects. Others turned to philosophy or mysticism. But a growing number began to seek intense experiences for their own sake, pursuing sensation and emotion with an increasingly desperate hunger. The relationship with other species during this period reflected the Aeldari's growing disconnection from the concerns of mortal beings. What had once been benevolent guidance gradually transformed into casual exploitation, as the Aeldari lost the ability to empathize with creatures they viewed as fundamentally inferior. Humanity was expanding during this period, Sunweaver noted with detached interest. We watched their crude colony ships struggling through the warp while we traveled instantly through the Webway. We observed their primitive technologies while we reshaped reality with concentrated thought. Some found their determination admirable in its futility. Others viewed them as an annoyance to be managed or removed as circumstances required. The raids and interventions that the Aeldari conducted on human worlds were not driven by malice, but by a casual indifference to the suffering of beings they viewed as essentially ephemeral. Their ability to see potential futures through psychic prophecy allowed them to justify almost any action as serving some greater cosmic purpose. If we could see that a particular human colony would eventually produce a poet whose words might inspire one of our own artists, we considered its protection worthwhile, Sunweaver explained. If instead we foresaw that the colony would become a source of pollution or ugliness, we might arrange for its destruction through carefully orchestrated disasters. The lives of individual humans mattered no more to us than the lives of insects matter to you. The pleasure cults that emerged during this period began as seemingly harmless pursuits of aesthetic and sensual experience. Master artisans sought to create works of such beauty that they could induce transcendent states in viewers. Chefs developed foods that could trigger specific emotional responses. Musicians composed pieces that could alter the listener's perception of reality itself. Each cult claimed to be exploring different aspects of the Aeldari experience, Sunweaver recorded. The seekers of perfect form pursued physical beauty to its ultimate expression. The connoisseurs of exquisite pain investigated the aesthetic dimensions of suffering. The children of eternal ecstasy dedicated themselves to experiencing pleasure so intense that it bordered on agony. All of them convinced themselves that they were contributing to our species' continued evolution. The gradual corruption of Aeldari society proceeded so slowly that even their most gifted prophets failed to recognize the danger until it was too late. Each new excess seemed like a natural extension of previous achievements. Each boundary crossed appeared to be simply another step in their ongoing transcendence. We told ourselves that we were evolving beyond the limitations that constrained lesser species, Sunweaver admitted with obvious regret. What we called exploration of the full spectrum of existence, others might have recognized as descent into depravity. But we had surrounded ourselves with such beauty, achieved such power, experienced such intensity, that we could no longer distinguish between transcendence and corruption. Sunweaver's memories of this period conclude with an observation that seems to contain the seeds of the coming catastrophe. We had become so focused on what we could do that we never stopped to consider what we should do. Our power had grown so great that we believed ourselves beyond consequence, beyond judgment, beyond the very concepts of right and wrong. We were gods in our own estimation, and gods, we told ourselves, could not fall. That hubris, more than any external enemy, would prove to be the architect of our doom. Chapter 3. The First Tremors. The account that follows was preserved in the spirit stone of Farseer Myrmidon's Star Whisper, whose prophetic gifts allowed her to perceive the first stirrings of what would become the greatest catastrophe in galactic history. Her voice carries an undertone of desperate urgency, as if she is still trying to warn her people of the approaching doom. The visions began as whispers in the warp. Star Whisper's consciousness sang through the crystal matrix, shadows moving at the edge of perception, dark currents flowing beneath the surface of our collective unconscious. At first, I dismissed them as the normal turbulence created by our civilization's vast psychic presence. But as the years passed, the whispers grew stronger, the shadows darker, and I began to understand that something unprecedented was stirring in the immaterium. The pleasure cults that had begun as elite artistic movements were spreading throughout Aeldari society with alarming speed. What had once been confined to small circles of aesthetes and sensation seekers was becoming a mainstream cultural phenomenon that affected every level of their civilization. The cult of the piercing note had begun performing symphonies that induced physical pain in their audiences, Star Whisper recorded with growing concern. They claimed that suffering was simply another form of music, and that those who rejected it were deaf to the full spectrum of existence. The dancers of the Crimson Veil had developed choreographic rituals that required actual bloodshed to achieve their proper effect. Even children were being taught that extreme sensation was the highest form of art. The interconnected nature of Aeldari society, which had once been their greatest strength, was now accelerating their corruption. The psychic network that linked their worlds allowed the influence of the most extreme cults to spread instantly across vast distances, infecting populations that might otherwise have been isolated from such influences. I watched entire worlds fall to the new philosophies within the span of a single generation, Star Whisper observed. Planets that had been bastions of traditional Aeldari culture suddenly embraced practices that would have horrified their inhabitants just decades before. The speed of the transformation was itself terrifying, as if our people were being influenced by something that operated outside the normal flow of time. The leadership of the Aeldari Empire was either unwilling or unable to address the growing crisis. Many of the ruling councils had themselves been infiltrated by cult members, while others were paralyzed by indecision or blinded by their own cultural biases. High Audarch Valdris dismissed my warnings as the fears of an overly cautious prophet, Star Whisper recalled with bitter frustration. He claimed that what I saw as corruption was actually evolution, the natural progression of a species that had transcended the limitations of conventional morality. When I pressed him about the disturbing reports coming from the outer worlds, he replied that growth always involved some degree of discomfort. The visions that plagued Star Whisper during this period were unlike anything in the recorded experience of Aeldari seers. Instead of the usual multiplicity of potential futures, she saw a growing convergence toward a single, catastrophic outcome that seemed to draw all possible timelines toward itself like a vast gravitational well. I saw our civilization as a magnificent crystal palace built on the edge of an abyss, she described in images that still seemed to pulse with prophetic power. For millennia, we had been adding new rooms and levels to this palace, each one more beautiful than the last. Yet the foundation was slowly cracking, weakened by forces we had released but never learned to control. In my visions, I could see the moment when the entire structure would collapse into the darkness below. The attempts to warn other Farseers about the approaching catastrophe met with skepticism and, increasingly, hostility. The variabilities that should have allowed them to perceive the danger were being clouded by the same psychic pollution that was corrupting the rest of their species. My sister seers accused me of allowing fear to cloud my prophetic vision, Star Whisper noted with profound sadness. They pointed to the continued prosperity of our empire, the ongoing achievements of our artists and scientists, the expansion of our territory and influence. How could such success be leading toward disaster? When I tried to explain about the growing hunger in the warp, they dismissed my concerns as the product of an oversensitive imagination. The entity that was beginning to coalesce in the warp from the accumulated excess of Aeldari civilization was still largely formless during this period, but its influence could already be felt by those sensitive enough to perceive such things. Star Whisper was among the first to recognize that their people's pursuit of ever more intense experiences was feeding something vast and malevolent in the immaterium. The thing that was growing in the warp fed on sensation itself, she explained. Every extreme emotion experienced by our people, every boundary crossed in the name of artistic exploration, every taboo violated in pursuit of new forms of pleasure. All of it was flowing into this entity, giving it substance and power. We were not just observers of our own corruption, but active participants in creating something that would eventually destroy us. The failed attempt to organize resistance among the more traditional elements of Aeldari society revealed how thoroughly the corruption had spread through their civilization. Even those who recognized the danger often found themselves unable to resist the allure of the new philosophies. I gathered a circle of like-minded seers and scholars to discuss the crisis, Star Whisper recorded. We called ourselves the Watchers of the Dying Light, and we dedicated ourselves to finding some way to turn our people away from the path they were following. Yet, even within our own group, I could see the influence of the cults. Members would speak passionately about the need for restraint and tradition, then depart to attend performances or rituals that embodied everything we claimed to oppose. The establishment of the first Craftworlds represented a desperate attempt by some Aeldari to distance themselves from the growing corruption of their core worlds. These massive vessels, each capable of supporting millions of inhabitants, were designed to be self-sufficient arks that could preserve Aeldari culture away from the toxic influence of the pleasure cults. The decision to abandon our homeworlds was perhaps the most difficult choice our people ever faced, Star Whisper reflected. We were being asked to give up everything that defined us as a civilization. Our beautiful worlds, our vast cities, our interconnected culture, in exchange for exile aboard cramped vessels drifting through the void. Many refused to believe that such extreme measures were necessary. The resistance to the Craftworld evacuations revealed the depth of the psychological hold that the corrupted culture had established over the Aeldari population. Even those who intellectually understood the danger often found themselves unable to abandon the intense sensations and experiences that had become central to their existence. It was like asking addicts to abandon their most precious substance, Star Whisper observed. The cults had not just changed our people's behavior, they had rewired their fundamental understanding of what made life worth living. To many Aeldari, existence without extreme sensation had become literally unthinkable. The prophecies that Star Whisper received during the final phases of the evacuation were so horrifying that she initially refused to share them with anyone. The visions showed not just the destruction of their civilization, but the birth of something far worse, an entity that would threaten the entire galaxy for millennia to come. "I saw the moment of birth," she whispered across the ages, "the instant when accumulated excess would reach critical mass and tear a permanent wound in reality itself. I saw worlds dying not from external attack, but from the unleashing of their own darkest desires made manifest. I saw the thing that we had been feeding with our corruption rising from the warp, like a dark god hungry for the souls of its creators. Most terrible of all, I saw that this was not an ending but a beginning, that the entity we had birthed would spread its influence far beyond our own civilization, corrupting and destroying countless other species in the eons to come." Star Whisper's final message, encoded in the deepest layers of her spirit stone, carries a warning that transcends the specific tragedy of her own people. We believed ourselves too civilized to fall, too intelligent to be deceived, too powerful to be destroyed. We thought that our achievements made us immune to consequence, that our sophistication elevated us beyond the reach of our own worst impulses. We were wrong. The greatest threats to any civilization come not from without but from within, from the corruption of the very virtues that once made them great. Let our fate serve as a warning to any species that believes itself beyond the reach of its own darkness. Chapter 4. The Pleasures of the Damned. The testimony that follows comes from an unlikely source, Zirath Doomweaver, one of the few cult leaders who retained enough sanity in the final days to recognize the horror of what he had helped create. His account, preserved in a spirit stone of dark crystal that seems to absorb light rather than reflect it, provides an intimate view of how the pleasure cults evolved from artistic movements into engines of corruption. "I was there when the cult of perfect sensation first discovered the art of distilled experience." Doomweaver's voice carries overtones of remembered ecstasy and eternal regret. "We had grown bored with conventional pleasures. Music, sculpture, poetry, even the most exotic foods and substances could no longer satisfy our refined sensibilities. We needed something more, something that would allow us to experience sensations that had never been felt before." The technological sophistication of Aeldari civilization provided the cult members with tools for exploring consciousness that would have been impossible for lesser species. Psychic amplifiers could magnify emotional experiences beyond normal limits, while neural interfaces allowed direct manipulation of sensory perception and memory. We developed machines that could extract pure pleasure from one mind and inject it into another, Doomweaver explained. Pain distilleries that could concentrate suffering into crystalline forms that would shatter in spectacular displays of agony. Memory weaving allowed us to experience the sensations of beings from other species, other dimensions, even other periods of time. Each innovation seemed to open new vistas of possibility. The progression from personal exploration to ritualized practice followed a pattern that Doomweaver now recognized as corruption, though at the time it had seemed like natural evolution. What began as individual pursuits gradually became group activities, then formal ceremonies, and finally elaborate festivals that drew participants from across the galaxy. The Festival of the Weeping Rose lasted for 3 years, he recalled. We had created a massive amphitheater on Shaddam, where pain and pleasure were indistinguishable, where participants could experience death and resurrection in cycles that left them permanently changed. By the end, many could no longer distinguish between reality and sensation, between self and environment. They had become living conduits for experience itself. The gradual abandonment of traditional Aeldari moral frameworks was presented not as corruption, but as liberation from arbitrary constraints. The cult philosophers developed sophisticated justifications for practices that earlier generations would have found abhorrent. We argued that conventional morality was a relic of our primitive past, Doomweaver noted. Why should beings of our advanced capabilities limit themselves to experiences deemed acceptable by lesser minds? We claimed that true transcendence required the courage to explore every aspect of existence, regardless of conventional taboos or emotional consequences. The involvement of non-Aeldari species in cult activities marked a crucial turning point in their descent into depravity. What had begun as self-experimentation expanded to include the exploitation of other races as sources of novel sensations and experiences. Human slaves provided particularly intense emotional responses, Doomweaver recorded with obvious shame. Their short lives and powerful feelings made them ideal subjects for our researches into the nature of suffering and mortality. We told ourselves that we were granting them transcendent experiences they could never achieve on their own, that their pain served a higher purpose in our quest for perfect understanding. The development of technologies that could preserve and replay experiences allowed the cults to create libraries of sensation that became centers of pilgrimage for experience seekers throughout the Empire. These repositories contained the crystallized essence of every form of pleasure and pain that Aeldari ingenuity could devise. The archive of infinite sensation on Ulthway contained over 1 million distinct experience crystals, Doomweaver recalled. Visitors could spend lifetimes exploring different forms of consciousness, different ways of perceiving reality, different modes of existence entirely. Some never left, becoming permanent residents who fed on the archived experiences until they lost all connection to their original identities. The psychic resonance created by these concentrated sources of intense experience began to affect the warp itself in ways that the cult members were too intoxicated by their own pursuits to recognize. The boundary between material reality and the immaterium started to blur in areas where cult activities were most intense. Reality became negotiable in the pleasure districts, Doomweaver observed. Physical laws would shift in response to the desires of those present. Time could flow backward if someone wanted to relive a particularly intense moment. Death could be reversed if the experience of dying had been especially exquisite. We thought we were mastering the fundamental forces of existence when in fact we were feeding something that would eventually devour us all. The entities that began to manifest during cult rituals were initially welcomed as manifestations of their own perfected desires. These beings, born from the accumulated excess of Aeldari civilization, offered to guide their creators toward even greater heights of sensation and experience. The dancers of eternal rapture first appeared during the ceremony of sevenfold ecstasy. Doomweaver remembered with a mixture of longing and horror. They moved with impossible grace, their forms shifting between beauty and terror, offering pleasures that transcended anything we had previously imagined. We believed they were angels of our own making, perfect beings created by our elevated consciousness. Only later did we realize that we had become their worshippers rather than their creators. The final phase of cult development saw the abandonment of any pretense of higher purpose or artistic achievement. The pursuit of intense sensation became an end in itself, with participants willing to sacrifice everything, their civilization, their species, even their own souls, for one more perfect moment of transcendent experience. We knew that our activities were destroying the foundations of our society, Doomweaver admitted. We could see the corruption spreading through our people, the madness taking hold in even the most distant colonies. Yet we could not stop ourselves. The experiences we were creating had become more real to us than reality itself, more important than survival, more precious than the continued existence of everything we had once held dear. The revelation that came to Doomweaver in the final days before the fall was both terrible and liberating. The understanding that everything the cults had achieved was not creation but consumption, not transcendence but damnation, not evolution but degradation into something less than what they had originally been. I realized that we had been feeding ourselves to something vast and hungry, he concluded. Every pleasure we experienced, every boundary we crossed, every taboo we violated, all of it was being consumed by an entity that we were creating through our own excess. We thought we were becoming gods, but we were actually becoming food for a god we had made from our own worst impulses. The tragedy was not that we fell, but that we fell so willingly, mistaking our own destruction for our ultimate achievement. Doomweaver's final words, preserved in the darkest layer of his spirit stone, carry a warning that seems directed toward any species that might follow the Aeldari path. Perfection pursued without wisdom becomes corruption. Power exercised without restraint becomes tyranny. Pleasure sought without purpose becomes addiction. We achieved everything we thought we wanted, and in doing so, we destroyed everything we actually needed. Let our fate remind the galaxy that the most dangerous enemy any civilization faces is not external conquest, but internal decay, the slow corruption of the very virtues that once made them worthy of survival. Chapter 5. The Exodus of the Wise. The account that follows was preserved in the Wraithbone Matrix of the Craftworld Webway, recorded by Farseer Eldred Ulthrin himself during the desperate years when a handful of prescient Aeldari attempted to save what they could of their civilization. His voice carries the weight of terrible knowledge and the burden of choices that saved millions while condemning billions. The signs were unmistakable to those with eyes to see. Eldrad's ancient consciousness spoke across the millennia. The warp storms that had begun as minor disturbances were growing in frequency and intensity. Worlds throughout the core systems reported reality distortions, spontaneous manifestations of impossible entities, and the breakdown of natural law itself. Yet, still, our people refused to acknowledge what their own actions had set in motion. The decision to construct the Craftworlds represented perhaps the most difficult choice in Aeldari history. These massive vessels, each capable of supporting entire civilizations, required the commitment of resources and personnel on a scale that strained even their vast empire. Each craft world was designed to be a perfect microcosm of our civilization, Eldrad explained. We could not simply evacuate populations. We had to preserve our culture, our knowledge, our artistic traditions, everything that made us who we were as a people. The engineering challenges alone were staggering, but the psychological difficulties proved even greater. The resistance to evacuation came not just from those who had embraced the pleasure cults, but from traditional Aeldari who simply could not believe that their magnificent civilization was truly doomed. The very success and longevity of their empire worked against efforts to convince people of the need for desperate measures. How do you persuade a people who have never known failure that they are about to experience the ultimate catastrophe? Eldrad asked with obvious frustration. We had ruled the galaxy for millions of years, survived the war in heaven, transcended every limitation that had constrained other species. The idea that we could fall, that our empire could end, was literally inconceivable to most of our people. The selection process for craftworld populations created agonizing moral dilemmas for those charged with deciding who would be saved and who would be left behind. Limited space meant the difficult choices had to be made about which individuals and which cultural elements deserved preservation. We prioritized those with the strongest connection to traditional Aeldari values, Eldrad admitted. Artists who had resisted the lure of the extreme cults, scholars who maintained their dedication to pure knowledge, craftsmen who still found meaning in creating beauty rather than sensation. Yet even these selections felt like betrayals. How do you choose which children to save when all are equally innocent? How do you decide which works of art deserve preservation when each represents millennia of cultural achievement? The craft worlds themselves became monuments to everything the Aeldari had accomplished, but also symbols of everything they were being forced to abandon. Each vessel contained libraries of crystallized knowledge, galleries of living art, and entire ecosystems transplanted from their dying homeworlds. Webway was designed around the principle of prophetic awareness, Eldrad recorded. Every chamber, every pathway, every decorative element was crafted to enhance psychic perception and facilitate communion with the warp. We knew that survival would require unprecedented foresight, the ability to perceive and avoid dangers that our ancestors had never imagined. The departure from the core worlds was traumatic even for those who understood its necessity. Many Aeldari found themselves unable to sever their psychic connections to their homelands, maintaining spiritual links that would prove both blessing and curse in the years to come. The severing of bonds was perhaps the most painful aspect of the Exodus, Eldrad reflected. Our people had been connected to their worlds not just physically but psychically, spiritually, emotionally. To leave meant cutting away part of themselves, becoming less than they had been in order to survive at all. Many never recovered from this trauma, spending their remaining years mourning not just for what was lost, but for what they themselves had become. The establishment of the path system aboard the Craftworlds represented an attempt to prevent the same psychological corruption that had doomed their empire from taking hold among the survivors. By channeling Aeldari passions into specific, limited pursuits, the paths were designed to provide meaning without the risk of excess. We learned from our civilization's greatest mistake, Eldrad explained. The pursuit of sensation for its own sake had been our downfall, so we created structures that would allow our people to experience intensity within carefully defined boundaries. The path of the warrior channeled aggression into protective service. The path of the seer transformed curiosity into beneficial prophecy. Each path provided fulfillment while preventing the kind of obsessive pursuit that had destroyed our homeworlds. The ongoing communication with Aeldari, who had chosen to remain behind, provided a horrifying real-time documentation of their civilization's final collapse. Messages transmitted through the Webway network became increasingly desperate, then incomprehensible, and finally ceased altogether. The last transmission from Shah Dam was received on the 127th day of our exile, Eldred recorded with obvious pain. The message was brief and nearly incoherent. The pleasure has become pain. The pain has become ecstasy. The ecstasy has become hunger, and the hunger grows without limit. We are feeding something vast, and it will never be satisfied. Save yourselves. Remember us as we were, not as we have become. The psychic shockwave that accompanied the birth of Slaanesh was felt throughout the Craftworld fleet, despite their distance from the core worlds. The entity that the Aeldari had unknowingly created through their own excess announced its existence by consuming the souls of its creators on a galactic scale. The moment of birth was felt by every Aeldari with even minimal psychic sensitivity, Eldred recorded. A scream of pleasure and agony that seemed to come from the warp itself. The sound of billions of souls being consumed by the very god they had fed with their desires. Many of our people collapsed from the psychic shock. Others were driven permanently mad by the knowledge of what we had done to ourselves. The immediate aftermath of the fall saw the Craftworlds scattered across the galaxy, as the psychic storms accompanying Slaanesh's birth made navigation through the Webway impossible. Each Craftworld found itself isolated, forced to develop its own response to the catastrophe that had befallen their species. We lost contact with most of our sister ships for centuries, Eldred noted. When communication was finally re-established, we discovered that each Craftworld had evolved its own interpretation of the path system, its own understanding of what it meant to be Aeldari in this new age of exile and diminishment. Some had embraced extreme asceticism. Others had developed militant philosophies focused on revenge against the thing we had created. All were changed by the trauma of survival. The discovery that Slaanesh's birth had also created the Eye of Terror, a permanent tear in reality where the warp bled through into the material universe, revealed the true scope of the catastrophe the Aeldari had unleashed upon the galaxy. Their civilization's collapse had damaged the fundamental structure of reality itself. We had not simply destroyed ourselves, Eldred observed with profound guilt. We had wounded the galaxy, created a permanent source of corruption and chaos that would threaten every species for millennia to come. The knowledge that our fall had made the universe a more dangerous place for all life was almost unbearable. The emergence of the Dark Eldar, those Aeldari who had survived the fall by embracing rather than rejecting their worst impulses, provided a disturbing mirror of what the Craftworld populations might have become under different circumstances. These twisted cousins served as a constant reminder of the thin line between survival and damnation. The ones who fled into the Webway's dark corners continued the practices that had doomed our empire, Eldred recorded with obvious revulsion. They sustained themselves through torture and excess, feeding on the pain of others to avoid being consumed by the god they had helped create. They were us, but without the wisdom that comes from recognizing one's own mistakes. In fighting them, we fought against our own worst potential. The long-term implications of their reduced numbers and scattered condition gradually became clear to the Craftworld populations. The Aeldari, who had once ruled the galaxy, now numbered in the millions rather than billions, their influence reduced to protecting small enclaves of civilization in an increasingly hostile universe. We went from masters of creation to guardians of memory, Eldred reflected sadly. Our role changed from shaping the galaxy's future to preserving its past. Yet, even in this diminished state, we retained responsibilities that transcended our own survival. The knowledge we possessed, the warnings we could provide, the interventions we could make, these might prevent other species from following our path to destruction. Eldrad's account concludes with observations that speak to the paradox of Aeldari survival. We saved our bodies by abandoning our civilization, preserved our culture by rejecting its highest achievements, maintained our identity by fundamentally changing what it meant to be Aeldari. The survivors are not the same people who built the great empire. We are their children, shaped by loss and limitation rather than power and possibility. Whether this transformation represents wisdom gained or innocence lost is a question each generation must answer for itself. Chapter 6. The Birth of Darkness. The most chilling testimony in this collection comes from Matcha Death Dancer, an Aeldari warrior who was present in the Webway during the actual moment of Slaanesh's birth. Her spirit stone pulses with corrupted energy that makes it dangerous to handle for extended periods. Yet her account provides the only first-hand description of the cosmic horror that the Aeldari unwittingly unleashed upon the galaxy. I was leading a reconnaissance mission through the abandoned sectors of the Webway when the birthing began. Matcha's voice carries undertones of madness that seem to infect the very air around her spirit stone. The passages that had been empty for centuries were suddenly filled with whispers, then screams, then a sound that had no name in any language, the voice of something vast and hungry announcing its arrival in reality. The Webway network, which had once been the Aeldari's greatest achievement, became the conduit through which their doom spread throughout their empire. The psychic resonance that connected every Aeldari world allowed Slaanesh's birth cry to reach every corner of their civilization simultaneously. The tunnels themselves began to bleed, Matcha recorded with horrifying clarity. Not blood, as any material being would understand it, but the crystallized essence of every pleasure and pain that our people had ever experienced. The walls of the Webway, which had been constructed from pure thought made manifest, started to crack and weep with the accumulated excess of our civilization. The entity that emerged from the warp was not born as a fully formed god, but as a ravenous infant deity that grew stronger with every soul it consumed. Matcha's description of Slaanesh's first manifestation defies rational comprehension, yet her words convey the terrible beauty and absolute corruption of the Dark Prince. She, he, it was simultaneously the most beautiful and most revolting thing I had ever witnessed. Matcha struggled to describe the indescribable. Perfect in every aspect, yet that perfection was so extreme that it became its own form of horror. The entity embodied every desire that had ever been felt, every pleasure that had ever been pursued, every sensation that had ever been craved, but amplified to levels that made them unbearable rather than enjoyable. The speed with which Slaanesh consumed the Aeldari population was matched only by the apparent pleasure the entity took in the process. Rather than simply destroying souls, the Dark Prince seemed to savor each one, extracting every moment of sensation and experience before finally consuming the essence itself. Our people did not simply die, Matcha observed with barely controlled horror. They were unraveled, their entire existence pulled apart thread by thread, so that the newborn god could experience every moment of their lives. Billions of years of accumulated memory, emotion, and sensation were devoured in minutes. The screams were not just of death, but of total dissolution, the complete erasure of everything that had made each individual who they were. The birth of Slaanesh created a resonance cascade throughout the warp that affected every psychically sensitive species in the galaxy. The psychic shockwave that accompanied the entity's emergence into reality was felt by telepaths and mystics across countless worlds, though few understood what they were experiencing. The humans felt it as nightmares and madness. Matcha noted. Their primitive psychers collapsed by the thousands, overwhelmed by sensations their minds could not process. The orcs experienced it as an intoxicating rush of violence that made them even more aggressive than usual. Other species simply fled in terror from something they could sense but not comprehend. The transformation of the Aeldari core worlds into what would become the Eye of Terror was not an instantaneous event, but a gradual dissolution of reality itself. As Slaanesh fed on the accumulated psychic energy of the Aeldari Empire, the distinction between the material universe and the warp began to break down in the regions where their civilization had been most concentrated. I watched entire star systems simply stop making sense, Matcha recorded. Planets where up and down became meaningless, suns that burned with impossible colors, space itself twisted into shapes that caused madness in any mind that tried to perceive them. The laws of physics had been suggestions in those regions. Now they became obsolete entirely. The few Aeldari who survived the initial consumption did so by accident rather than design. Some were too far from the core worlds to be immediately affected. Others were protected by Webway anomalies or psychic shielding, and a handful simply proved too bitter or twisted for even Slaanesh to find appetizing. Survival was random rather than deserved, Matcha admitted with obvious guilt. I lived not because I was wise or strong or pure, but because I happened to be in a section of the Webway that collapsed before the gods' influence could reach me. When I finally emerged into normal space, I found a galaxy transformed by our civilization's death throes. The immediate aftermath of the fall saw reality itself struggling to heal from the wound that the Aeldari had inflicted upon it. The birth of the Eye of Terror created a permanent fissure between dimensions that would continue to bleed corruption into the material universe for millennia to come. We had broken something fundamental about the way reality works, Matcha observed. The barrier between the warp and normal space, which had always been permeable but stable, was now permanently ruptured in a region spanning thousands of light years. Demons could manifest in the material universe without summoning. Chaos could influence events without cultists, and the very concept of natural law became negotiable in the affected areas. The behavior of Slaanesh in the immediate aftermath of its birth revealed disturbing aspects of the entity's nature. Rather than being satisfied by the consumption of its creators, the Dark Prince seemed to view the Aeldari's destruction as merely the first course of an eternal feast. The god we had created was not content with destroying us, Matcha noted with growing horror. It began reaching out to other species, seeking new sources of the sensations and experiences that sustained it. The humans were particularly vulnerable to its influence, their emotions strong, and their psychic defenses primitive. I realized that we had not just doomed ourselves. We had unleashed something that would corrupt and destroy countless other civilizations. The discovery that some Aeldari souls were still trapped within Slaanesh's domain, experiencing eternal torment as the god fed on their essence, added another layer of horror to an already incomprehensible tragedy. These souls served as both sustenance and entertainment for the Dark Prince, their suffering refined into ever more exquisite forms of agony. I could hear them sometimes, Matcha whispered across the millennia. The voices of those who had been consumed but not destroyed, trapped forever in a realm where pain and pleasure were indistinguishable, where every moment stretched into eternity, where the only escape from suffering was to embrace it so completely that it became a form of transcendence. They begged for death, but death was no longer possible for them. The long-term implications of Slaanesh's existence gradually became clear to the surviving Aeldari. The god they had created would continue to claim their souls upon death unless they took extraordinary measures to protect themselves. The spirit stones that became central to Craftworld culture were not just repositories of memory, but literal shields against eternal damnation. Every Aeldari who died without proper protection would feed the god we had made from our own excess, Matcha explained. Our species' survival required not just physical life, but spiritual vigilance, constant awareness that our souls were claimed by an entity that would torture them for eternity, if given the opportunity. We had become prisoners of our own creation, forever haunted by the consequences of our ancestors' mistakes. Matcha's final observations carry the weight of someone who witnessed the end of the galaxy's first and greatest civilization. We thought ourselves beyond consequence, beyond judgment, beyond the very concepts of right and wrong. We believed that our sophistication made us immune to the laws that governed lesser species. We were wrong. The God we birthed from our own desires now threatens every form of life in the galaxy, and will continue to do so until the end of time itself. Our fall was not just the death of a civilization, but the birth of eternal corruption, a wound in reality that will never heal, a hunger that will never be satisfied, a darkness that will never lift. This is our legacy, not the beautiful empire we built, but the terrible god we became. Chapter 7. The Shattered Mirror. The testimony that follows comes from Yvraine, she who would later become the emissary of Iniad, though at the time of these events she was merely another survivor, struggling to understand what her people had become. Her account spans centuries of exile and adaptation, revealing how the Craftworld Aeldari gradually developed the rigid structures that would define their existence for millennia to come. The first years after the fall were marked not by grief, but by incomprehension. Yvraine's voice carries the weight of someone who has witnessed the full arc of her species' transformation. We had saved our bodies but lost our souls, preserved our culture but abandoned our purpose. The Aeldari who emerged from the Craftworlds were not the same people who had entered them. We were refugees from our own former selves. The psychological impact of the fall affected every aspect of Craftworld society. The survivors found themselves unable to trust their own emotions, their own desires, even their own thoughts. Every impulse had to be questioned, every feeling examined for signs of the corruption that had destroyed their civilization. Paranoia became our defining characteristic, Yvraine observed. Not paranoia about external enemies, though those were real enough, but fear of our own nature. We had learned that our greatest virtues could become our deadliest vices, that our most sophisticated achievements could become instruments of damnation. How do you live when you cannot trust yourself? The development of the path system represented an attempt to channel Aeldari passion into safe and productive directions, but it also reflected a fundamental loss of faith in their species' ability to moderate itself. The rigid structures that defined each path were not just guidelines but psychological straitjackets, designed to prevent any recurrence of the excess that had doomed their ancestors. Each path was a form of voluntary limitation, Yvraine explained. The warrior path channeled aggression into protective service, but it also prevented the exploration of violence as an aesthetic experience. The artisan path encouraged creativity within specific boundaries, forbidding the kind of unlimited experimentation that had characterized our empire's final period. We traded freedom for safety, possibility for survival. The relationship between different craftworlds revealed how profoundly the fall had affected Aeldari civilization. Each vessel had developed its own interpretation of what it meant to be Aeldari in this new age, leading to philosophical divisions that sometimes erupted into actual conflict. Biel-Tan embraced militant restoration, believing that we could reclaim our former glory through force of arms, Yvraine recorded. Ulthwé focused on prophetic vigilance, seeking to prevent future catastrophes through foresight and intervention. Saimhan maintained nomadic traditions that predated our empire, viewing settlement and complexity as inherently corrupting. None of us were wrong, but none of us were entirely right either. The encounters with their corrupted cousins in Kamara provided disturbing insights into alternative responses to the fall. The Dark Eldar had chosen to embrace rather than reject the impulses that had destroyed their civilization, sustaining themselves through the torture of others rather than seeking spiritual redemption. They were what we might have become if we had chosen survival over conscience, Yvraine noted with obvious revulsion. They proved that physical survival was possible without spiritual growth, that our species could persist even while becoming something monstrous. In fighting them, we fought against our own worst potential, but we also confronted the possibility that our path of restraint and limitation might not be the only way forward. The discovery of other Aeldari survivors scattered throughout the galaxy revealed the full scope of their species' dispersal. Exodites who had fled before the fall, Corsairs who had embraced nomadic freedom, Rangers who had abandoned the Craftworlds for individual wandering, all represented different responses to the same fundamental trauma. We were no longer one people, but many peoples, united by shared ancestry, but divided by radically different visions of what survival should mean, Yvraine observed. The empire that had once spanned the galaxy was replaced by isolated communities that could barely communicate with each other, let alone coordinate their actions against common threats. The gradual realization that the Aeldari were no longer the galaxy's dominant species came as a shock to many survivors. Humanity was expanding during this period, claiming worlds that had once been Aeldari territories, while other xenospecies filled the power vacuum left by their empire's collapse. We had fallen from masters to refugees in the span of a single generation, Yvraine reflected. The humans in particular seemed to embody everything we had once been. Young, ambitious, convinced of their own righteousness and destiny. Watching them make the same mistakes we had made was like seeing our own history reflected in a broken mirror. The development of the aspect system within the warrior path represented both adaptation to their diminished circumstances and acknowledgement of the specific threats they now faced. Each aspect was designed to counter particular enemies or challenges that the Craftworlds encountered in their exile. The Dire Avengers were created to fight the Chaos cultists who emerged in the wake of Slaanesh's birth, Yvraine explained. The Fire Dragons developed techniques for combating the demon engines that had begun appearing on former Aeldari worlds. Each aspect was a response to a specific form of corruption or threat, but collectively they represented our transformation from creators to warriors, from builders to destroyers. The emergence of the Harlequins as preservers of pre-fall culture and history created tension within Craftworld society. These warrior artists maintained traditions and performed stories that many found too painful to remember, serving as living reminders of both what had been lost and what might yet be reclaimed. They danced the old stories with perfect accuracy, Yvraine recorded with mixed emotions. The tales of our empire's glory, our achievements, our transformation into gods of our own making. Watching them was like looking into the past and seeing ourselves as we had been before. Fear taught us humility. Some found their performances inspiring. Others considered them dangerously nostalgic. The prophecies surrounding Aeneid, the potential Aeldari god of the dead, began to emerge during this period as a possible answer to their species' greatest problem. The entity that might one day be born from the accumulated souls in the Craftworld infinity circuits represented hope for eventual freedom from Slaanesh's claim. The possibility that we might create another god filled many with terror, Yvraine admitted. We had seen what our previous attempt at divinity had accomplished, yet the alternative, eternal subjugation to the entity we had fed with our excess, seemed even worse. Ennead represented both potential salvation and the risk of repeating our ancestors' greatest mistake. The gradual acceptance that their current state might be permanent rather than temporary marked a crucial psychological transition for the Craftworld populations. The exile that had begun as a desperate escape gradually became a way of life, then a cultural identity in its own right. We stopped talking about returning home because we realized that home no longer existed, Yvraine observed. The Craftworlds were not temporary refuges, but our new homelands. The paths were not emergency measures, but our permanent culture. We had become something new, not the Aeldari who had built the great empire, but their children, shaped by loss and diminishment rather than power and possibility. Yvraine's reflections on this period conclude with an observation that speaks to the fundamental transformation of her species. We learned to live small lives instead of great ones, to find meaning in limitation rather than transcendence, to measure success by what we avoided rather than what we achieved. Whether this represented wisdom gained through bitter experience or simply fear masquerading as prudence is a question that each generation must answer for itself. We survived, but survival is not the same as victory. We endured, but endurance is not the same as triumph. We became something other than what we were, and whether that transformation represents evolution or devolution remains to be seen. Chapter 8. The Dark City's Shadow. The account that follows was recorded in the most secure vaults of Ulthwé, spoken by a former Drukhari raider who had somehow escaped Kamara and sought redemption among the Craftworlds. Known only as the Penitent, this anonymous figure provides a harrowing glimpse into how the other survivors of the Fall chose a radically different path to escape Slaanesh's hunger. I speak these words, knowing that many will refuse to believe them. The Penitent's voice carries the particular cadence of someone who has witnessed horrors beyond description. The city that exists in the Webway's darkest corners is not merely a refuge for those who embraced our civilization's worst impulses. It is the logical conclusion of those impulses, the place where the Aeldari who refused to learn from our fall have created something even worse than what we originally destroyed. Kamara had been established in the deepest recesses of the Webway during the final centuries before the fall, initially as a haven for those Aeldari who recognized the approaching catastrophe but refused to abandon their traditional pursuits. What began as a sanctuary gradually transformed into something far more sinister. The founders told themselves they were preserving true Aeldari culture, the Penitent explained. They gathered the most dedicated practitioners of the pleasure cults, the most skilled torturers and sensation seekers, the artists who had pushed their craft beyond conventional morality. They claimed to represent our species' highest achievements rather than its greatest depravity. The architecture of the Dark City reflected the twisted aesthetics of its inhabitants. Built from materials that existed partially in multiple dimensions, the structures seemed to shift and change according to the desires and fears of those who observed them. The buildings themselves were instruments of torment, the Penitent recorded. Towers that existed in impossible geometries designed to induce madness in viewers. Amphitheaters where the acoustics amplified screams into symphony. Galleries where living beings were displayed as art objects. Every aspect of the city was calculated to maximize the suffering of those unfortunate enough to be brought there as slaves or prisoners. The society that developed within Komara represented a complete inversion of traditional Aeldari values. Where the Craftworlds had embraced limitation and self-discipline, the Dark City celebrated excess and cruelty. Where the exiles had sought to atone for their ancestors' mistakes, the Drukhari gloried in perpetuating them. We convinced ourselves that survival justified any action, the penitent admitted with obvious shame. The hunger of Slaanesh could only be avoided by feeding our own souls with the suffering of others. Each torture session, each act of cruelty, each moment of inflicted agony helped us stave off the god's attention for a little longer. We became predators not from choice, but from necessity, or so we told ourselves. The raids conducted by Drukhari forces against the material universe served multiple purposes beyond simple sustenance. They provided fresh victims for the city's torture chambers, but they also allowed the inhabitants to experience the sensation of power and dominance that had once been their birthright as rulers of the galaxy. Each raid was a reminder of what we had once been, the penitent explained. When we struck at human colonies or orc settlements, when we demonstrated our technological superiority and inherent elegance, we could briefly recapture the feeling of being masters rather than parasites. The slaves we took were trophies of our continued relevance in a galaxy that had forgotten our former glory. The political structure of the Dark City was based on constant competition and betrayal, reflecting the inhabitants' belief that suffering should be equally distributed among all social classes. The cabals that ruled different districts engaged in elaborate schemes against each other, using torture and humiliation as tools of political advancement. Trust was not just absent but actively discouraged, the penitent noted. Loyalty was viewed as weakness, cooperation as vulnerability. Every interaction was a potential trap, every relationship a weapon waiting to be used. We had created a society where paranoia was rational and cruelty was practical, the logical endpoint of our species' worst tendencies. The worship practices that developed within Komara represented a fascinating paradox. The inhabitants simultaneously rejected and embraced the entity that their civilization had created. While they refused to serve Slaanesh directly, their entire culture was organized around feeding and appeasing the god through proxy. We hated the Prince of Pleasure for claiming dominion over our souls, yet we served her, him, it through every action we took, the penitent observed. Every scream we extracted, every drop of agony we distilled, every moment of perfect torment we created, all of it ultimately fed the god we claimed to resist. We were rebelling against our Creator by becoming exactly what she, he, it wanted us to be. The technology that sustained the Dark City was itself a testament to the inhabitants' corruption. Ancient Aeldari devices had been modified to serve purposes that their original creators would have found abhorrent, while new innovations focused exclusively on maximizing suffering and degradation. We perfected the art of keeping victims alive and conscious through tortures that should have killed them instantly, the penitent recorded with clinical detachment. Pain amplifiers that could make a pinprick feel like dismemberment. Memory editors that could force beings to relive their worst experiences in endless loops. Sensation multipliers that could turn pleasure into agony and agony into something transcendent. The relationship between the Dark City and the Craftworlds was complex, mixing mutual revulsion with grudging recognition of shared ancestry. Occasional truces and temporary alliances occurred when external threats required cooperation, but these were always temporary and often ended in betrayal. We knew that the Craftworld Aeldari viewed us as corrupted beyond redemption, the penitent explained. Yet we also knew that they sometimes needed our services, information that only we could gather, raids that only we could conduct, dirty work that their rigid codes prevented them from undertaking. We were their dark mirror, the reflection of what they might have become under different circumstances. The process that had led to the penitent to abandon Kamara and seek redemption among the Craftworlds was described in terms that suggested a form of spiritual awakening. I began to understand that we had not escaped Slaanesh's influence but had become its most dedicated servants, they revealed. Every moment of suffering we inflicted was a prayer to the God we claimed to hate. Every scream we extracted was an offering to the entity we pretended to resist. We had achieved immortality by becoming everything our species should have rejected. The reception that the penitent received among the Craftworld Aeldari revealed the complex emotions that surrounded their species' divided nature. Some viewed the former Drukhari as irredeemably corrupted, while others saw them as lost family members who might yet be saved. Redemption proved to be a longer and more painful process than damnation had been, the penitent concluded. Learning to feel empathy after centuries of cultivating cruelty, discovering conscience after deliberately suppressing it, finding meaning in creation rather than destruction. All of this required constant vigilance and endless patience. Yet the possibility of redemption exists, which suggests that even the worst choices need not be permanent. Whether the Dark City itself can ever be redeemed, or whether it represents a permanent stain on our species' honor, remains to be seen. The final observation from the penitent carries particular weight given their unique perspective on both sides of Aeldari society. The Craftworlds represent our species' attempt to learn from its greatest mistake, while Kamara embodies our refusal to acknowledge that mistake at all. Both are responses to the same trauma. Both are attempts to survive in a galaxy that no longer recognizes our former glory. Whether wisdom lies in embracing limitation or rejecting it entirely is a question that only time can answer. What I know is that both paths exact a terrible price. The Craftworlds trade possibility for safety, while the Dark City trades morality for power. Neither path leads back to what we once were, but perhaps that is for the best. Perhaps what we once were was always destined to fall. Chapter 9. The Children of the Stars. The testimony that follows comes from the Exodite settlement of Harenduo, recorded by a dragon knight named Korath Dawnrider, whose people had fled the core world centuries before the fall. His account provides a unique perspective on the Aeldari catastrophe from those who had anticipated and escaped it through radical lifestyle changes. We saw the corruption spreading through our people like a disease. Korath's voice carries the calm certainty of someone whose warnings proved prophetic. While our cousins in the great cities pursued ever more elaborate pleasures, we retreated to the frontier worlds and embraced a simpler way of life. When the fall came, we were not surprised, only saddened that so few had listened to the wisdom of restraint. The Exodite philosophy had emerged during the height of the Aeldari Empire as a reaction against the increasing complexity and artificiality of mainstream culture. These early dissidents believed that their species' growing disconnection from natural cycles and basic existence was creating dangerous psychological imbalances. Our ancestors recognized that power without purpose becomes corruption, Korath explained. The great cities offered every conceivable pleasure and convenience, yet their inhabitants seemed increasingly empty and desperate. We chose to abandon the gifts of technology in favor of the older gifts of earth and sky, of seasons and cycles, of birth and death in their natural forms. The establishment of Exodite worlds required tremendous sacrifices from populations accustomed to the luxuries of Aeldari civilization. Advanced technology was abandoned in favor of traditional crafts. Immortality treatments were rejected in favor of natural lifespans, and psychic powers were limited to their most basic applications. Learning to live within limitations was the hardest lesson our people ever faced, Korath admitted. Generations raised in the certainty that any desire could be fulfilled had to adapt to environments where survival required effort, where death was permanent, where suffering could not be easily avoided or transcended. Many of the early colonists could not make this transition, and either returned to the core worlds or died from their inability to adapt. The symbiotic relationship that the Exodites developed with the world spirits of their chosen planets represented a fundamental alternative to mainstream Aeldari philosophy. Rather than seeking to dominate their environment through technology, they learned to work in harmony with the natural forces they encountered. Each world possessed its own form of consciousness, Korath described with obvious reverence. Not the artificial intelligence that our cousins created in their machines, but something organic and ancient that had evolved alongside the planet itself. We learned to communicate with these spirits, to understand their needs and desires, to become part of their natural cycles rather than imposing our own patterns upon them. The Dragon Knights that served as the Exodites' primary military force embodied their philosophy of working with rather than against natural forces. These warriors bonded with the great lizards that inhabited their worlds, creating partnerships that transcended the normal relationship between rider and mount. "My dragon, Starfall, is not my servant but my companion," Korath explained. "We share thoughts and emotions, dreams and fears. Through our bond, I experience the world as she does, feeling the magnetic fields that guide her flight, sensing the chemical signals that carry information across vast distances, understanding the deep rhythms that connect all living things. This partnership teaches humility in ways that no amount of psychic power ever could." The Exodite response to the fall was marked by sadness rather than surprise. They had long prophesied that their cousins' pursuit of sensation and power would lead to catastrophe, yet they took no satisfaction in being proven correct. When the psychic screams of the dying reached even our distant worlds, we wept for the civilization that was lost, Korath recorded. Despite our philosophical differences, those who perished in the birthing of the Dark Prince were still our people, our families, our ancestors. Their pain became our pain, their destruction our loss. We had saved ourselves, but we could not save them. The isolation that followed the fall forced the Exodite communities to become completely self-sufficient in ways that even their pre-fall preparations had not anticipated. The collapse of the Webway network meant that trade and communication between worlds became impossible, leaving each settlement to survive on its own resources. We learned that independence is not just a philosophical ideal, but a practical necessity, Korath observed. Each world had to develop its own solutions to the challenges of survival, its own interpretations of our shared beliefs, its own responses to the threats that emerged in the aftermath of the fall. This diversity of approach has proven to be one of our greatest strengths. The encounters with other surviving Aeldari factions revealed significant philosophical differences that had developed during their isolation. The Craftworld Aeldari viewed the Exodites as primitive and backward, while the Exo Warhammer 40,000 lore, the doom of the Aeldari, lore to sleep to. The galaxy's eldest children and their fall from grace, a meditation on the price of perfection. I discovered the testimonies in a vault beneath the ruins of Bieltan, sealed away by farseers who had foreseen their own world's destruction, yet still hoped that someone, someday, might learn from their civilization's greatest tragedy. The crystal matrices that contained these memories were unlike anything in Imperial archives, living jewels that sang with the voices of the dead, their surfaces shifting between colors that had no names in human languages. The first voice belonged to an Aeldari poet named Iriel Morvain, who had lived through the final centuries of their empire's glory. Her words, preserved in crystalline song, spoke of beauty so perfect it could drive mortals mad, of cities that spanned continents and floated among the stars, of a people who had achieved everything that lesser species could only dream of, and who had been destroyed by that very achievement. We were the galaxy's first children, her voice whispered across millennia of grief. Before humanity learned to make fire, before the orcs knew war, before even the Necrons surrendered to their deathless sleep, we walked among the stars as gods. We shaped worlds with a thought, created life with a song, and bent the very fabric of reality to our will. Time meant nothing to us, for we were immortal. Distance meant nothing, for we had conquered space itself. We believed ourselves beyond consequence, beyond judgment, beyond the very concepts of loss and mortality. As I listened to these ancient voices by candlelight in my study, high above the hive spires of Mordian, I began to understand the true scope of what had been lost when the Aeldari fell. This was not simply the collapse of another empire, but the death of possibility itself, the end of the galaxy's first and greatest civilization, and the warning of what awaited any species that reached too high without understanding the price of transcendence. What follows is their story, told in the voices of those who witnessed the rise and fall of the most beautiful and terrible empire the galaxy has ever known.